Well, I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. I want you guys to know that one thing I've discovered from making these tapes is that I'm a really terrible singer, so sorry about that. Song is somewhat appropriate, of course, to our particular moment, though. So, where we are right now, of course, is in the middle of antebellum America. Should have got these cards a little bit closer for us, right? And I told you the primary issue, of course, of the antebellum America is this is America heading towards the war. And there are a number of important things I wanted to highlight for you guys, of course. I've already done the dynamic growth. We see the nation growing extraordinarily in terms of population growth, in terms of territorial expansion, in terms of economic growth. The second major issue, of course, as the growth is occurring, we run into a situation where the House is becoming increasingly divided. Now, the House divided comes from a speech that was delivered by Abraham Lincoln, the phrase itself. And he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. It must become all of one thing or another." He borrowed that line from another antebellum orator who actually took it from the Bible, the house divided. But it does become kind of the essential reality of the United States in the later part of the antebellum period. And my suggestion to you is that by the time we get to about 1850, the nation is becoming like two different nations, one northern and one southern, and that's the component, that is the expression of your essay question. I want you to characterize both sides and help me to help show that you understand what's happening in this increasingly house divided. Well, we see the North and the South kind of going in different directions. I'm going to give you the road analogy in just a second, but just to let you know, there was really, there was a guy named Frederick Law Olmsted, and he did a lot of things in his life. He's an interesting man. He designed Central Park, among other things. I think he also did the Golden Gate Park in terms of San Francisco. But he took some tours, through the South. He was a northerner from New York, and he took some tours from the South. And he wrote books about them. He wrote books about his travels through the Middle South and the Deep South. And the books sold, they sold in the North. And I just find it fascinating that Northerners would perceive the South as being so different that they would read a book about it. Now, you and I probably would not read a book about Escondido or Oceanside. We've been there, we know those places, right? But they're not different to us. They're not unique to us in any kind of way. But Northerners began to perceive the South as being distinct and different, and something they might read about. And I have to tell you, it worked the other way too. There were Southerners who would travel up to the North, and they would write about that. Here I am in the wilds of New York City, and all the other Southerners like gasping, "Oh my God, I can't believe what it's like up there." But you really do begin to see, by the time you get to the North and the South are diverging in a very significant way. And as you can imagine, that's going to be a problem as far as the continuation of the nation. Okay. The way I like to present this to you is I use the road analogy, and I think it works. So we could just simply say that the United States of America is a road, and that road began in 1776. And in the beginning, all Americans were on that road. They go off on the road, and there's a lot of commonalities in America in 1776 that will begin to, some of them disappear. It was mostly a rural agrarian society, North and South, it didn't matter. There were slaves, North and South, of course, many more concentrated in the South, but there were slaves in the North also. They were all agreement in terms of essential purpose, that they wanted to become independent. They would ultimately agree upon the essential principle of the Constitution. It's expressed in the Constitutional Consensus. So you really have a nation pretty much on one road heading off into the direction, of course, of the future. Now, they continue on that road. I have to tell you, the road will continue on. But at some moment, I can't tell you exactly when it is, for whatever reason, I want to say like 1810 or something like that. Not that that necessarily is going to tell us what's going on here. Anyway, things begin to change a little bit, all right? Now, one thing I need you to know is that the Southerners are going to stay on the same road. The South will remain on the same road. They continued, so much of what they saw was the essential nature of the beginning of the nation. They continued to be rural. They continued to be agrarian. They continued to own slaves. Remember that the founding fathers, many of them owned slaves. So I have to tell you that, when things begin to become more apparent that change is taking place, the Southerners would often say to the North, if George Washington came back today, he would not identify with you Northerners, he'd identify with us Southerners, And I think that they were absolutely right. He could understand the nature of the South, probably more than he could have understood the nature of the North. So the South is remaining on the same old road in many ways. And of course, because they perceived it as the original road, that it was the right road, it's the road that they should be staying on. Now what they couldn't know, of course, is that this road basically, ultimately, is a historical dead end. It's a very intriguing dead end, I have to tell you, though. I mean, it's a dead end that, continues on for so long you can't believe it. Even in the aftermath of the Civil War, there are those Southerners who pretty much stay on that path, and this notion of the South rising again, or I can't remember what the name of this stupid thing is, but this belief kind of that the South was always right and the South was always just, that continues to be, a component kind of at least some Southern thinking, even to this day. The fact that you had all those statues to the Confederacy that remain really unchallenged until just recently are kind of an indication of Southerners, remaining on a road that we perceive generally as not the road of the nation. Okay, so but it's a very long cul-de-sac that goes deep into American history, and intriguingly there seem to be some people, some Southerners, who still live on that road. Now the critical thing that's happening, though, is that the North is beginning to diverge. Don't worry about the size of these things, that doesn't matter exactly, okay, but the North is diverging. And I always think to myself, if we're going to blame the Civil War on who changed or something like that, sometimes I personify it. What if it was a couple, and the couple were living along, of course, and the couple were getting along okay because they were in basic agreement about everything, and then one side changed, and if you can get along with change. There's no doubt about that. You don't have to be exactly the same, especially in a personal relationship. But what if one side changed, and the changes became increasingly kind of deal breakers, that the relationship couldn't continue? Well, if that happens, of course, you're going to kind of blame the person who changed, right? The one person stayed the same, the other person changed, and so they begin the process of heading towards the breakup. So if we take that analogy, it's the North. The Northerners were the first to change. Well, they're the ones who changed. They're going to go off in a different direction, and that's going to be a foundation for what increasingly becomes a problematic relationship between the North and the South. So the North heads off in a different direction. Now I want you to know where the North is going, because it's very, very important in American history. So, if I were doing this on the board, I'd have my signposts. I'd put, like there were signs that were along the northern road, if you will. And I can't quite do it as easily right in the situation. So instead, I'm going to hold the signs up for you. These cue cards I've been using all along. So one of the signs in the North that was heading the North off in a different direction was urbanization. I told you that urbanization is kind of, it's an expression of modernization, and the North was going in that particular kind of way. And the cities were larger in the North, of course. The cities were more important. The cities more diverse. All of those were factors that began to transform the North. The more urban they were, the more different they were going to be, at least as far as the South was concerned. Another major signpost, and all these are things I've kind of suggested to you already, was immigration. The immigrants who came to America generally came to the North, so the North becomes more diverse, of course, and is impacted by the immigrants in ways that the South was not quite as much. And immigration in its own way is a transformative process, and indeed something that is a reflection of an increasingly modern America. So this was a big signpost that was leading the North off in a different direction. And then finally, and probably most importantly, industrialization, transforming the nature of the human experience as far as the North was concerned in so many ways. It's not just an economic development, it has a huge kind of social impact, impacting all components of life. So these were the signposts that were heading the North off in a different, they're becoming more urbanized, there's more immigrants there, it's becoming more industrialized. And the one sign I should have written for you guys, I should have written, I forgot, the ultimate sign of where they're going is the sign of modernization. The North is heading into the modern world. The South was not. The North is heading into the modern world. And, and really it's critically important because, if you want to know our historical address as our contemporary America, then our historical address is 2020 Northern Road, United States of America. The Southern Road will not be the road of the nation. The Northern Road is the road of the nation. And indeed, of course, as it takes off in its own direction, it's going to be very problematic in terms, of course, of the relationship between the North and the South. So it is my intent in this portion, on this top, in this moment of the House Divided, to kind of show you the North and show you the South and just show you how different they have become, and to suggest you, of course, that this is beginning to create the foundation for what will lead to a breakup, what will lead to the Civil War, right? So we're going to start with the North because the North there's more to tell, to be honest with you. It makes sense, right? If the South is staying the same, then there's not as much to tell. But the North is also, of course, the most dynamic component and heading us towards our world. They're heading us towards our world. So the way I want to do this, my heading here, and I forgot again to do my outlines for myself to show you guys, but remember it's always a good idea to get the outline for the topic as you're starting so you can just have it with you and you can be aware of where we're going. And at some point, of course, you will also have the study sheet which you can look to make sure that you're catching what components are identifications. But the North is, it becomes kind of the essential issue, essential situation that it becomes important for us to see. So I describe the North as being in the thrall of change, in the thrall of change. Now the word thrall is a little bit old-fashioned, to be honest with you, and I think if you trace it back far enough, like into medieval Europe, it actually means slave. We don't necessarily use it very much, but you probably heard enthralled, to be enthralled, be captivated by someone. So in some ways, that's what I'm suggesting to you. The North is in the thrall or kind of captured by this situation of change, the enormous changes that are taking place in the North. I've always wondered, what would be a really good example of something that's in the thrall of something. And this is dumb, but this is what I think of. Whenever you put your clothes in the dryer, and I have to tell you, this works. For our perception, it works best if you're like at the laundromat. You've got a big dryer, of course. You got that big window, and then you turn that dryer on, and you see the clothes just getting tossed all over the place. Okay, so I would say that the clothes are in the thrall of the dryer at that particular moment. Or in a situation where you're kind of out of control. Change is just the essence of things. I think we know that, of course. The universe is constantly changing. The earth is constantly changing. The climate changes, of course. Our lives change, of course. People come, people go. Civilizations change. I mean, that's the essence of things. But we all probably know that there are times when the change is just kind of so intense and so rapid that it becomes overwhelming. So what I'm trying to say to you is that the North is experiencing a tremendous amount of change. And I've already told you the engines of it. The engines are urbanization, the engines are immigration, the engines are industrialization. These are the things, these are forces at work transforming the society. But in the antebellum period, it was like too much and too fast. The changes are coming so fast, so rapidly, and everything is changing so quickly that it led to a sense of dislocation in the North. It led to a sense of being overwhelmed. It led to a sense of chaos, that the North has become incredibly chaotic, essentially. So and the North really is not terribly happy. They're sitting in a world where things are changing on a daily basis, and it's hard to sort of keep up with the whole thing. And so the characterization I want you to have is that the North is in the thrall of change and kind of feeling overwhelmed by change and trying to figure out, how do you confront this? If everything is changing that rapidly, how do you deal with that, essentially? So, one thing that I want to suggest to you is, there's a variety of ways you can deal with it. There's kind of a sense of crisis in the North. I think that's, something that's going on there because of the amount of change, because of the chaos generated by the change. Whenever there is crisis, you can respond in so many different ways. And one way that Northerners would respond, is by escapism. Escapism is one thing you can do. And we see in the antebellum North kind of a lot of this sort of activity. There's a book written about it's really the nation, but the North is kind of this focal area, about America in the 1830s, and the title is The Alcoholic Republic. So you just have a sense of just a tremendous amount of self-medication. It seems like, I can't remember what the statistics were, but men are drinking gallons and gallons of hard liquor per annum. And it's kind of like they're drinking all the time. You drink, during the day, you drink at night, you drink when you're working, you drink before you go to church, you're just kind of drinking all the time. And it's this kind of generalized inebriation to keep them from having to confront some of the realities that are just kind of hard and stark for them at that time. This one's a little bit interesting because it kind of crosses the sectional lines. The Southerners are drinking too, but maybe there's a different reason why they're drinking quite so much. But, there were crazy fads at this time. What do you call it? Human magnetism, what is it called? Hypnotism. Hypnotism became a thing, and spiritualism became a thing, and people were using ether and kind of having ether parties. And I got to tell you, ether, that could go really wrong. You could, snort a little too much of that stuff, sniff a little too much in, and maybe pass out or something like that. So, and this is the era of the rise of P.T. Barnum, and Fool is Born Every Minute sort of thing, and major entertainment stars like Tom Thumb and others. It's kind of like our world, right? We endlessly seek distractions to kind of keep us from some of the harsh realities of our moment in our world, through sports or through the movies or through the variety of different crazy things that we can pay attention to. And of course, I'm sure you guys know there's a lot of Americans today who self-medicate in a variety of ways, to avoid maybe the confrontations, to confronting all the world of change and all the problems that we are living in. So we see that as kind of an expression in the North. The Northerners are sort of freaking out about everything that's happening to them. and some of them are going to go just use escapism. It's a way to kind of just avoid the entire situation if you possibly can. But Americans generally don't run from crisis. It's kind of been indicated time and time again in American history. So what happens in the North is not so much a general attempt to escape the problems that they were feeling or escape this extraordinary feeling of change and the chaos associated with that, but rather to confront it. And so we see in the North a fairly significant reform movement, trying to reform, trying to fix the problems. It's a common phenomenon in America. You could argue that maybe the revolutionary period is a reform movement, that this is going to be a second big one, the progressive era at the turn of the century, the New Deal during the Great Depression, activities during the 1960s. Who knows? Maybe we're in a sense, I'm feeling a sense of crisis in America. Maybe we'll have another big reform movement that will try to get us back on track, as we begin the 21st century. I don't know. But Americans, this is something they do. Sometimes it gets a little bit out of hand, and so they then seek to try to fix that, and we see them kind of moving into a reform movement. So the essential way that I want to characterize the North is that they're feeling very much out of whack by the enormities of the changes that are taking place, but also seeking ways to confront it, to try to figure out how can they get around it, or how can they deal with this. I think not so much get around it, but try to deal with it as best they possibly can. So we see the Northerners responding to this sort of sense of the crisis of change in a variety of interesting ways. And here's the first one I want to highlight for you. There is in the antebellum North a monumental movement of revivals. So the revivals are an evangelical Christian activity. I must tell you that I come from a fairly secular situation. And even in my youth, I went to church regularly, a Calvary Presbyterian church in Riverside, California. And it was a very, kind of intellectual church. The ministers always had to be PhDs, I'm pretty sure, or whatever, Doctor of Divinity, the degree that they would have. It wasn't terribly emotional at all. So I've never really personally experienced this. And the revival concept, of course, even of the evangelical Christians is a very emotional kind of dynamic of, crying and holy rolling and speaking in tongues and people touching you and you're passing out. Just that extraordinary religious kind of passionate activity that simply becomes the essential expression of the revival. I must tell you that I've never really been part of that, but I have a sense of it, of course. And historically, we can read about it, of course. You can see it in revival churches even today. Well, there was just this moment there, kind of in the North, where this seemed to be the way to confront the problems that they were facing at that time. One thing we find is that revival movements correspond routinely to a sense of social and economic crisis. Now, I hope you don't think this is hypocritical. I just think it's the way it's basic human nature. When everything is wonderful and good, you're lying on the beach enjoying the sun or something like that, you're not necessarily really turning to your faith. I'm not saying that you don't. Maybe you do, but that's not what you're thinking. You're not thinking about God and your faith. But when times get hard, when people are sick, when there's a pandemic or something like that, or other kind of grand crisis, then those are the times, of course, when you turn to your faith, and it's not a bad thing. I haven't really been a prayer through much of my adult life, to be honest with you, but I got really sick one time, and it was during my semester. I had to miss about 2/3 of the semester, and my students, were concerned with me. There's no doubt about that. I have to tell you, they didn't know exactly what was wrong with me, and I remember getting some of the early emails during that time. Are you going to die, Professor Johnson? I hope not. Anyway. But students started to email me, and they were telling me that they would pray for me, and they would tell me that they were bringing up my name in their church and getting the congregation to pray for me. And I have to tell you, it was very touching. What can I say? And it did then begin to kind of motivate me to want to pray more. Use prayer also. I was in crisis. I was hurting, physically hurt. I was beginning to be more paralyzed by my situation. I had something called Guillain-Barré, and anyway, the thing that I thought was that, I was so appreciative of people praying for me, but I thought that I shouldn't pray for myself. I should pray for everybody else. And, I've continued to do this. I pray for my students. I do it kind of in a generic way. Dear Lord, bless all my students, past, present, and future. So if nothing else, that covers everybody. But my attempt to do that. But, I hope you don't see that as hypocritical, but I was in crisis. I was really hurting at that time. I needed something, and so I turned to prayer. You turn to your faith in those moments when you need it, when these things are very critical. And in the North, in this moment, there's a sense of crisis, there's a sense of dislocation and chaos, and the Northerners sort of need it. But we see revivals occurring in peaks of socio-economic crisis. So, for instance, during the Great Depression, serious revival activity, of course. I'm guessing that we're going to have a little bit more intensity. The only problem right now, with the revival idea, is that in a pandemic you can't create that community of believers all coming together, which really creates, I think, the dynamism of the revival. So we're actually but I'm sure that there are people, of course, that are conferencing with each other and having fairly significant religious activities one way or the other. All those social media ways we have to come together. It's they can still continue to do that. So. In the antebellum period, the interpretation is it's a time when people are feeling out of whack, so they are turning to their faith as a way to overcome the problems that they are feeling. And we do see a huge revival activity occurring in the north. Now, the reason we noted it, it could have just occurred inside the churches, but it was so big, it attracted so many people, and we're estimating somewhere around 3 million Northerners. Remember that's a minority of the population, 21 million people in the north, but still, that's a lot, 3 million Northerners. And it was so big that it couldn't be held by the churches. So they had to take their revival activities out of doors. And they created the traditions that became known as the camp meetings, where there'd be a campground, and all the participants would come there, and they would have huge religious activities. We're talking 20,000 people, 30,000 people, the preacher up front, the entire audience, the congregation engaged massively, the holy rolling, of course, the speaking in tongues, the people collapsing, the crying, all of those, the manifestations, of course, of this extremely emotional religious activity became apparent, and they called parts of New York the burned over district, because it just the revivals were like a wildfire. They'll burn one way and then burn back, and more people becoming involved in the whole thing. So the revivals clearly are an interesting expression, that can help us characterize the North in the antebellum period. So, to give you some specific information on the revival, I'm going to focus your attention on one particular person, and his name was Charles Finney. Charles Finney was a tall, handsome, charismatic, no doubt about that, individual. I always feel kind of bad that I don't necessarily know that much about the person. I think he'd been a lawyer before. He later became pretty much a minister. But he just became one of the very important revival leaders. He was one of these preachers who could attract huge crowds, of course, who could really roil the crowd, get them all becoming part of this. And Charles Finney then can just simply represent for us, what's happening in the North during the revival activity. Now, Charles Finney, I don't know that much about him as the human being necessarily, but I know exactly, what his message was, because this becomes the foundation of his prominence. He would come before, these camp meetings. So he's out there on some podium, and, there are stories of him addressing as many as 20,000 people. I've always wondered how you did that exactly, because you all know that there's no microphones, so how could you, communicate? And, maybe it's the great microphone in the sky. I can't tell you exactly what's going on there necessarily. And by the way, I missed one thing, remember that the historical interpretation is that the revivals are corresponding to moments of crisis and, economic problems and things like that. If you were there on the ground, though, if you're part of the revival, of course, you just think the Holy Spirit is coming down and touching you. And who's to say that they're not right? The historians have to put their kind of secular interpretation on what is happening here, but who's to say that the revivalists aren't really in tune with the essential reality? Anyway, so, he would gather these large crowds. Again, I don't know how you could communicate to so many people. I one time took my class outside because it was a beautiful spring day. This was over by the clock tower. And I remember losing my voice very quickly because I felt like I had to, project all the way to the extremes of the entire area, even though the students were pretty close, but there was, lots of background noise and stuff like that. There's at least some non-magical ways of conveying what the speaker would say. There'd be like guys would stand in the crowd with, a megaphone, and when they heard what the guy said, they would repeat it out there so more people could hear it. You could actually communicate to fairly substantial groups of people without too much difficulty. But what becomes critical for Charles Finney, of course, is, what is the message that he's trying to convey? So he had a 3-part presentation. So 3 major things that he's going to push as he would begin his preaching. And the first thing he's going to present is what I'm going to call moral free agency, what he would call moral free agency. I do need to address this a little bit because it shows a historical development, especially in Protestant Christianity. So last time we talked about religion really seriously, of course, was way back with the Puritans. And you guys all know that there was still a lot of religion in America. This is not so much, of course, the only one at fault here is me, and not necessarily, focusing on all the religious activities of America. A lot of things were going on there, okay? But if you remember back in the Puritan days, that the primary person motivating the theologian was John Calvin. And John Calvin presented his notions of divine election and predestination. And those were, those are the kind of, and remember what the whole issue is, that God is so huge and awesome, of course, and the human being's like a little ant, and that God has determined everything about your life, including, when you're born, how you live, when you die, and most importantly, if you're saved or if you're not saved. Now, for whatever reason, that was attractive in those days, that God has already chosen everything for you, and you just have to live that life out. You just play out, you're the puppet that plays this kind of thing out. But as we move more to the modern world, there began to be more of a free will dynamic, and it's associated with the rise of liberty notions, of equality, those kind of things, People were not quite as happy thinking that God was like the dictator of their existence and they had no impact upon it whatsoever. So we see the beginning to the emergence of a free will doctrine in Protestant Christianity. I have to tell you that it's coming about up in two major developments that are called the Great Awakenings. There was the first Great Awakening that happened sometime around the Revolution. Didn't tell you anything about that. Sorry about that. This is actually what we would consider to be part of the Second Great Awakening. And both of these things, the notion was empowerment. You are no longer, of course, simply the pawn of God, but rather God gives you the free will to become the person you should be, and of course the critical part of it to seek your own salvation. So what he's saying is that the individual is a moral free agent. It's not like you're trapped in some determinate situation. You are a moral free agent. You have the ability to affect your own outcome. It's most importantly to affect your salvation. So what Finney would do, he'd come out to the crowd. First thing he wants to do is kind of give them a basic statement of empowerment. He would say to them, your life is the life that you choose. You choose the path that you want to go over. Now you can choose the path of sin and damnation, of course. You can choose to drink. You can choose to fornicate. You can choose to be an adulterer. And by the way, I love talking like this. You can choose those things, right? But remember, it's your choice. And if you go down that path, that is the path of sin and damnation, and that's going to take you directly to hell at some point. On the other hand, he would say, of course, you are also our moral free agent who can choose the other path, another path, You can choose the path of righteousness. You can choose to take Jesus Christ into your heart. You can choose to live by the precepts of the Bible. You can choose to be the good person. So he's just trying to make a basic statement of empowerment. Your life is your choice. The end of your existence is your choice too. Are you going to go to hell? Are you going to go to heaven? That's basically your choice. Okay, so first thing he was trying to do is just tell everybody right there, this is your choice. You can do this. So I can see how the crowd reacting. They're listening. They're going, oh my God, it's my choice. I've been living a bad life, but I can fix that. I can turn that thing around. So he then went on. So it starts out with the concept of moral free agency. Then he says, if you choose the right path, if you take Jesus Christ in your heart, if you seek the grace of God, of course, and follow the precepts of the Bible, then you can achieve what he called perfection. And perfection was really just what we would call the knowledge of your own salvation. In more recent Christian parlance, that could be like to be born again. That's the critical thing that the Christian seeks. The goal is salvation, but the problem is, are you saved or are you not saved? And what Finney was saying, if you make the right choices, you'll know you're saved. You will achieve perfection, and you are on your way to heaven, guaranteed kind of situation. And I have to think that this is like the emotional explosion moment of his presentation. First, he's told them that they have the power to change their lives, essentially their moral free agents to choose the right path. Then he says, look what's going to happen, man. You make these choices, you are going to achieve your own perfection. And I picture then, people coming down and being touched and crying and speaking in tongues and rolling on the ground and all those, incredible emotional and physical activities that become an essential expression of the revival. Now, that's this for the individual. That's the critical. All those things are the critical things, that you are a moral free agent and you can achieve your perfection. But what I think is intriguing, and this is where he reaches out to the larger world in many ways. So here's where it becomes more of a social component. What about the entire society? And the reflection here is that Finney is worried about the society. He's worried about the North. He's worried about the nation. So he said, if enough of us choose the right path, if enough of us achieve our perfection, then we, all of us, can achieve the millennium. We can make the millennium happen. Now, the millennium, of course, in the Christian religious parlance well, first of all, the word millennium is just Latin for 1,000 years. But in the religious parlance, in theological notions, this is the 1,000-year reign of Jesus Christ on earth, the coming of the kingdom of heaven, the coming of the kingdom of heaven. And if you think about it, who better to lead us out of our sense of turmoil? Who better to lead us out of this feeling of crisis, of the overwhelming sense of change that's taking place than Jesus Christ? We will achieve the situation where Jesus will come back, and he will assist us and guide us through all of these particular situations. This is, Christianity is a waiting religion. There's a lot of waiting religions out there. But Jesus leaves, of course. He gives the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter. Peter says, when you will be back, and Jesus says, soon. And from that moment on, the Christians have been awaiting the second coming. Some of them more intensely than others. Some moments kind of creating that intensity where the world seems to be being destroyed, and that will bring about this incredible kind of moment. Some of them people preparing themselves, some of them willing to, massively, or groups, suicides in anticipation of this moment, in anticipation of the rapture. This is something that Christians have always thought about, at least some Christians have always thought about. And there are moments in time when, especially in moments of crisis, where people feel more intensely about this. And I do believe that this is kind of what was going on in the antebellum North, that people were hoping this would happen because it will solve their problems. Now, if you are wondering, this didn't happen, okay? Not that it couldn't have happened, not that it won't happen at some time, but it didn't happen in that particular kind of moment. I have to tell you this little thing, but my wife's good friend when she was a child was a girl named Julie. And Julie grew up, and she lived in Northern California, we live in Southern California, but they kept ties, for quite a long time. And I think this was like 1983 when we'd just been married for 3 years. And Julie calls up Patty. And Julie was evangelical Catholic, but she had gotten a notion that the world was going to come to an end. It was going to come to an end on like May the 23rd or something like that. And she was reaching out to her good friend, her childhood friend Patty, and she wanted Patty to come to some place in Oregon because that's where all the good people were going to gather, of course. And and I want you to know that I noticed almost immediately she was not inviting me. This is just for Patty, okay? And Patty, my wife, was just like, oh, really? Okay, the 23rd in Oregon? We'll have to check my, Patty just tried to figure out how to deal with this particular kind of issue. Now, I have to tell you that, of course, we were a little bit bemused by this, but then when May 23rd came, I spent the whole day walking, thinking, oh my God, is this good? And of course, on May the 24th, I'm like, Patty, why don't we call up Julie and ask her what's happening in Oregon? There are moments when people expect, that to happen, of course, and it hasn't necessarily happened, of course. Will it happen? That's an issue far beyond the ken of my humble abilities. Anyway, it didn't happen. And I have to tell you, there was an incredible enthusiasm for the revivals. They kind of really build there. And then, maybe it lets out the angst of the moment and they began to kind of subside also. But we shouldn't think that the revival, Charles Finney's activities and the revivals in general were a failure, because they really weren't. So they didn't, bring about this kind of transformation of society, but they did bring about, they did kind of, they brought order to the lives of individual people. They really seem to have that impact. I have to tell you, if we really look at who this impacts, is pretty much like the middle class men in the North. These guys had been sort of a pretty rough lot. They drank a lot. I kind of gave you a sense that they were drinking maybe a little bit too much. They weren't really good workers necessarily. They were often unkind to their wives and children. Of course, that's a very kind of nice way of saying what they were doing. But, these men got involved in the revivals, and it made them straighten up pretty much. They began to drink less and be more attentive to their work and be more attentive to their political responsibilities and be kinder to their wives and kinder to their children. So it actually does have an impact. And some people would suggest that what's happening out of those revival is the foundation of the solid modern middle class. These middle class people whose feeling is, of course, that we should behave ourselves, we should be good citizens, and we should be good social actors and economic actors, and all those things that the middle class kind of believes in. So, even though it didn't bring about the coming of the kingdom of heaven, it did bring about change in America, in the North especially in the behavior of particular individuals. So we do see an interesting kind of outcome from these revivals of people trying to get their lives back together as much as they could. Now, at some point in the revival, there began to be just a general notion that you couldn't get the entire society, the entire North, or entire nation, of course, to become part of this activity. So, and I told you already that only about 3 million out of the 21 million people in the North were involved, and you can imagine a whole bunch of people that weren't involved, like, the Irish immigrant Catholics or some, that they looked at that and they go, what are these people all about, of course, But, there were others who really just wanted this still to happen. They didn't think that they could reform the entire society, so instead they decided to kind of remove themselves from the larger society, simply prepare themselves and their smaller groups for the coming of the kingdom of heaven. And we describe these groups that began to appear in the North as these utopian communities. So the utopian concept, of course, is a perfect human society, a perfect human community. And there were those who thought that they could do that. They couldn't fix the whole society, but they could fix their own little group. And their own little group would simply, that'd be good enough, and that would be in preparation for the coming of the kingdom of heaven. It's kind of that notion, that not everyone gets to be saved. There are going to only be some that can be saved, and these guys are going to kind of work upon that basic notion. Now, the utopian community activities are very interesting in this moment. I got to tell you, it's very similar to the 1960s. It's an anti-establishment activity. You're looking at the larger northern society, you're looking at the larger northern establishment and kind of rejecting it, thinking that they're messed up, they're going crazy, it's getting too crazy out there, and removing themselves from it. In the same way that in the 60s, we wouldn't have called them so much, utopian communities in the city. We call them communes and stuff like that. All these young people kind of, dropping out and moving to the country and trying to live a natural life and, and experimenting in a variety of different kind of interesting human behaviors too. But similar kind of thing, in the 60s was a total rejection of the establishment, a total rejection of the larger community. Same thing happening in the North. These people were unhappy with what's going on, and so they're going to try to make their own little groups and make that the center of kind of what they hope will be this perfect human society. Now, there's a bunch of these that happen, and it's kind of interesting. Many of them were religious focused. There's no doubt about that. Brook Farm was more literarily focused, and a lot of literary lights of that era kind of came to Brook Farm and their little experiment, which I think many of these fall apart in the same way the communes kind of fell apart in the 60s. These are going to fall apart pretty quickly too. Many of them had a kind of intense focus on work, so I think it's interesting that what began as a utopian community evolves to become like a company. The Oneida community, evolved to become the Oneida company making silverware. The Amana community ultimately became the Amana appliances. They did focus on work, they did have interesting outcomes, but not necessarily the original intent of that community. But I do want to tell you about one of these utopian communities that I think is really interesting and becomes just simply a good example of what's happening in the North in terms of these utopian communities. There was one group of Americans who began to remove themselves from the larger American society, and they became known to us as the Shakers, And the Shakers were kind of called the Shakers in the same reason the Quakers were called Quakers. It was an expression of their faith, I guess, that was perceived by others, that they would maybe shake in the side of God instead of quaking in the side of God. But the Shakers become a very prominent manifestation of a utopian community as far as the North is concerned. Now, the founder of the Shaker movement was a woman by the name of Mother Ann Lee. Well, her name was Ann Lee, and they called her Mother Ann Lee. She was actually from England and lived most of her life in England, to be honest with you. Suffered some really difficult times in her life, I think including in childbirth and deaths of members of her family. It turned her to a particular vision of faith, and she would bring that vision over to America. She actually came during the colonial period, and I think she only survives until the Revolutionary period. But she had some ideas that she introduced to the United States, ultimately, that will begin to come to fruition somewhat later, as far as after she dies. But in the beginning, there weren't many people kind of adhered to the ideas of Mother Ann Lee. That maybe they were too radical for them. I don't know. But when you get to like the 1920s, all of a sudden, 1820s, in the antebellum period, with so much activity and so much chaos, her notions became increasingly attractive to more and more people, and we see people beginning to join into the Shaker communities. At their height, there were about 6,000 Shakers, so do understand, very much a small minority of the people we're talking about in the North, okay? 6,000 out of 21 million. And they began to reside in some 24, about 24 Shaker communities, scattered primarily, of course, across the northeastern part of the United States of America. I do want you to know that the most southern one was actually in Kentucky, but it really more reflected kind of the North. That's just one in the south. The rest of them are in the north, and many of them in the area of New England. When we were back east doing our little kind of fall colors trip one time, I actually got to go to a Shaker community. And it was just really interesting to get to kind of experience a little bit about what they were all about. Anyway, the Shaker communities began to form themselves primarily in the northeastern part of the United States. So, what I'd like to do is give you kind of the two sides of the Shaker experience. And to me, they're interesting juxtapositions about what the Shakers were all about. So on the one hand, they were very conservative. And this is mostly just a conservative expression of their basic lifestyle. One thing that is just very apparent about the Shakers is their extraordinary desire for order. And clearly it's a rejection of the larger society, which they saw in chaos. And, so much change, so much chaos. They wanted the world that they lived in to be a world of absolute order and symmetry. They lived on these Shaker farms, and the Shaker farms, and that's what they call the entire community. I should have said the Shaker farms. The Shaker farms were these extraordinarily kind of wonderful farms, routinely created on something of a kind of a base of symmetry. Symmetry, of course, is the essential notion of balance as much as you possibly can. If you have a building and you have a door here, you need a door here. Okay, if you have a window there, you need a window there. So you're always trying to balance everything. And they do seem to believe in kind of the absoluteness of symmetry because it maintains it. And the farms were usually beautifully kept, basically, and the farm areas were just amazing, of course, in terms of their order and everything. An indication of this kind of overwhelming desire for order, though, that I find very interesting, is they believe that when you walked, you should walk generally in a straight line. It's not a good idea to do, meandering or something like that. And when you turned, you should turn at a right angle, You shouldn't just kind of banana turn and, you should up and turn. And they thought it was better to turn right than it was to turn left. And I've always thought to myself, so what does that mean? You come up to a point, I got to go that way, so I go this way, and then, I don't know if they would do that necessarily, but, a kind of indication of the intensity of their desire for things to be as orderly as they possibly could, all right? They believed in their faith in a quiet spirituality. They're kind of like the Quakers in the sense that it's a personal relationship with God. It's prayerful. It's meditative. They would get together in various activities to some degree, but again, you don't really have a minister among the Shakers. You're kind of one-on-one with your God. So it's this really quiet kind of spirituality that was the essence of it. And then one of the hallmarks of the conservative side, as far as the Shakers are concerned, a life of work. They're very much of that kind of Calvinist work ethic, Puritan Protestant work ethic notion that to work is your vocation. You're called by God to work, and that's the way that you honored God. And of course, it made them just amazingly productive in their agriculture and in so many other kind of ways. When you go to the Shaker farms, just the extraordinary nature of the organization they put onto the whole thing. They had, in this one we went to, was big. I think they probably had close to 400 to 500 people living. It's in New Hampshire, and quite a few buildings, of course, that were part of it. Not that all of it's still remaining there, but one big building was just dedicated to washing, where they would subdivide. Of course, the clothes would come in from all over, and every piece of clothing had like a letter and a number, and the letter would be, I think there were three things. There was a letter, a number, and something else, of course. And one of them would be designating the building it would go back to, and one of them was designating the room it would go back to, and one of them would be designating like the drawer it went back to. I mean, just this extraordinary kind of sense of order. But they also created machines, of course, that would allow them to wash their clothes, and ovens that would allow them to bake multiple pies at the same time. Just amazing kind of in there. And they were very technological. They were nothing like the Amish. They don't reject technology at all. In fact, they moved forward, and they lived into the 20th century, many of them. And as soon as the radio came out, they were interested in that, and the TV came out, and the computer came out. All these things were inoffensive to them. They thought they were very good ideas, but this work was kind of amazing. They were amazing craftsperson. Here's some of their interesting inventions. The Shakers will come up with a flat broom. So it used to be just like a stick, and you just take a bunch of straw and you tie it on there, of course. I'm going to call that the witch's broom, if you want. But the Shakers were the first to weave all those pieces of straw into a flat, make a flat surface. And of course, you guys all know that flat surface is so much more effective in sweeping than a round one was. The only bad news about the flat brooms, of course, was that they weren't very good when you played Quidditch. You really need your Nimbus 2000 if you want to make that whole thing work. The witch's broom's much better for Quidditch, of course. That is my only Harry Potter reference for the entire class. I want you guys to know. But anyway, it wasn't just that. They invented the clothespin. Their clothespin actually was it's not the spring-loaded one. That's going to come a little bit later. But the piece of wood one where you just get, carved wood, and you use the tension between the two pieces of wood. And, if you push it too hard, you're going to break that. But that original clothespin was of the design of the Shakers. They were the first to sell packaged seed, and this was primarily because of the fact that all these people would come to the Shaker farm, they'd be amazed by the productivity, and they'd want to do the same thing if they possibly could, of course. And I always think it's so interesting, you look at the plants of a gardener who does really well, and you think you can take that home and do it. It isn't so much the plant, of course, it's the garden. Does the gardener take care of it with the same kind of ways? And I don't know about you, but I've sort of been a serial killer as far as plants are concerned over the course of my life, and I do feel very badly about that. But they also made extraordinary furniture. This is one of the classic expressions of the Shakers. For the antique people today, of course, Shaker furniture is extraordinarily valuable. I was watching like a Talking Head PBS show or something like that, or just a documentary, excuse me, on the Shakers. And it was a chest of drawers, just a 3-drawer chest of drawers, and it went for $150,000. I went home and I thought, oh my God, all right, do we have a Shaker chest of drawers? I mean, simple in design and nothing really fancy about it, but just really extraordinary craftsmanship, which of course has made a huge value as antiques, at least as far as today is concerned. So on the one hand, you've got these, these conservative people living lives of absolute order as much as they possibly could, with a quiet, personal, meditative spirituality, with focus on hard work, kind of the daily efforts of hard work. All of this is a suggestion of kind of this conservative side. But on the other hand, they were very radical. I mean, the Shakers are clearly radical, and this is where the kind of notions of Mother Ann Lee are going to come into play. So, for instance, they did not believe in the family. There's not going to be any families in the Shaker community. If you join the Shaker community, of course, and many families did, then that's over. The men go over to their dormitory, the women go over to their dormitory, the children, of course, are subdivided based on age. Older boys are going to go with the men, younger boys are going to probably stay with the women. Although I do think in some of them that the children are kind of separated out. Absolutely, they're going to live in their own with women whose job it was to kind of oversee and take care of them. There were no marriages. They didn't believe in marriage, of course. They believed in abstinence. There was no sex in the Puritan community. And of course, you might guess, how do you reproduce if that's the case? And of course, the answer is you don't. You simply cannot reproduce. And in the beginning, the way that they built the population was just through recruitment. And people would come in and even volunteer to become Shakers. Over time, when the dynamic of that recruit, the reason for becoming a Shaker began to fade, as it does in the later antebellum period, then they found themselves a little more difficulty. And one methodology of recruitment was to take in orphans. And by all accounts, they were very good to the orphans. They're going to give the orphans a good place to live. They're going to give them good, give them all the clothing they need, food to eat, solid education, all those kind of things were part of it. So that was one way to kind of bring children in, of course, and maybe begin to prepare them for the Shaker lifestyle. The good news for me was that they gave every single child who lived there, of course, the choice ultimately, I think at the age of like 17, do you wish to remain as part of the Shaker community, or do you wish to go out into the larger world, of course? And they're not going to force them to be Shakers. And I got to tell you, I'm pretty sure that we're looking at about 10 out of 10 of these kids said no. They're going to leave. They're going to take off. It's hard for a 17-year-old to make these kind of decisions, of course, at that particular moment of their life. So, there's a kind of a radical quality to what's going on. I have to tell you that the Shakers, for them it was a problematic nature of any kind of love relationship between a man and a woman. And the stories are that, if a man and a woman began to feel an attraction to each other, then they would go, to the people that were in charge of the Shaker farm and tell them, and they would routinely be separated. It's like they don't want that to happen. And in this one Shaker community I visited, and we're talking about, like 150 years of the Shaker experience on that farm, there were only, I think it was like 2 marriages, so that means 2 failures, right? But it's pretty amazing, all of those people, and yet only twice did it fail, that the man and women decided they're going to continue that relationship, they're going to get married, they're going to leave the Shaker community. One last component of their radicalism is that they did believe in sexual equality. They believed that men and women were equal. I have to tell you that I really want to be the fly on the wall in this kind of stuff. People make claims that they believe that men and women are equal. But this is in the early part of the 19th century. It's the Victorian period. It's the age of men, basically, and women were received as distinct second-class citizens. So I'm always wondering, did these men were they really willing to accept the women as their equals, or was that just something that they would say? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they were absolute egalitarians, and I hope I'm wrong in that regard. They also were anti-slavery, so there's other kind of components of their radicalism that I could suggest to you. In the end, of course, the Shaker experience began to fade to some degree, and that's because of the dynamic, because that they believe in celibacy, no marriage, and no family creating. But they would simply remain in their communities well into the 20th century, awaiting the coming of the kingdom of heaven. And I'm pretty sure that there are still about 6 or so Shakers left, okay? They're existing even in the 21st. I think there's only one Shaker farm that's still considered a Shaker farm, with just a few individuals who continue to live on that, of course. And they say that they're still there awaiting the coming of the kingdom of heaven. I do want you to know one last interesting manifestation of this moment. And you could call it Utopian Community if you want, but it's the story of the rise of the Mormonism. Joseph Smith was of this era, of course, an individual seeking, trying to determine the nature of his faith in New York. He's going to find these plates at Mount Gomorrah, of course, that will set him on a line of this distinct kind of Christian branch that he will begin to focus upon. Fairly quickly, as you probably know, the Mormons are going to come under the gun, primarily because of their Book of Mormonism equated to the Bible, but also, of course, polygamy, that they believed in multiple marriages, which may in many ways just have been a way of managing the fact that there were so many more men than there were women. And persecution ensues, of course, and the Mormons are increasingly rousted out of one place or another. Joseph Smith will be martyred, and they will ultimately make their way out, of course, to their Zion in Utah, where the beehive is the symbol of their community. All these people working together, of course, for the benefit of the whole. So really, if you look at what comes out of that utopian community experience and that religious environment, the most successful one by far is the Church of the Latter-day Saints, with an increasingly large global population. I think much of the actual the conversions are taking place outside the United States, much more than they are within, in both areas. But very successful, to say the least, and continuing a major part of the American story in their own way. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a few more things, but I'll take a little break here and I'll get right back to it as soon as I can.